The first light of April 7, 1945 crept across Tokyo Bay like a blade sliding from its sheath. The sky held that thin, pale gold only seen at the edge of dawn, a fragile calm before steel and fire would scar the horizon. 91 P-51D Mustangs, their silver wings catching the rising sun, carved silent contrails over the sea. To the men strapped inside, this wasn't just another mission. It was a strike at the heart of an empire once thought unreachable. Major James B. Tapp sat cocooned in the narrow cockpit of his Mustang, his gloves resting lightly on the control stick. Beneath the humming skin of the aircraft waited 650 caliber Browning machine guns, each loaded with armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The guns were more than weapons. They were a promise that the enemy would see America's reach stretch further than anyone believed possible. He glanced briefly to his left. Wing after wing, row after row, the formation stretched into the distance, disciplined and precise. Far below, Mount Fuji pierced the soft veil of morning clouds, its snow-tipped peak glinting like polished ivory. For these pilots, the mountain was more than a landmark. It was a silent witness. It guided them forward, a fixed point against a shifting sky. They had crossed over 700 miles of open water to reach this place, a distance military planners once declared insurmountable for single-engine fighters. On the ground, farmers in the surrounding fields lifted their heads toward the growing rumble. Few recognized what they were hearing. That sound, a steady, thunderous chord, wasn't the drone of familiar Japanese engines. It was foreign, deeper, relentless. In minutes, soldiers stationed around the capital would look up and see something their commanders had sworn they would never witness. American fighters, not bombers, over Tokyo. The Japanese high command had long relied on geography as their shield. Distance, they believed, was invincible. Single-engine fighters could not, would not, cross that stretch of Pacific and still fight. But the roar above Tokyo Bay shredded that illusion in a single stroke. For the pilots on the ground, the sight of the Mustangs cutting through the morning haze was a psychological blow sharper than any bomb. Flight Sergeant Totanamizu of the 56th Sentai would later admit, "We thought they were ghosts. No one believed it was possible." Their training, their confidence, even their faith in the war itself, cracked in that instant. This was not the gradual erosion of morale. It was the sound of it breaking. At altitude, Tapp's flight held formation, the sun gleaming on polished metal like a fleet of airborne blades. The calm rhythm of their flight belied the extraordinary nature of what they had achieved. Behind the clean lines of the Mustang lay factories working through the night, assembly lines pouring out machines with mathematical precision, and engineers who had turned impossible distances into mere coordinates on a map. The mission ahead would change the air war over Japan forever. But at that moment, with Fuji to the west and Tokyo beneath their wings, it was enough simply to exist in that silence before the storm. In that fragile breath of dawn, the Empire of Japan was about to learn that no distance was far enough. The aircraft that roared above Tokyo wasn't simply a fighter. It was the end product of an empire's assembly lines, a machine designed with ruthless elegance. The North American P-51D Mustang was born from a marriage of aerodynamic innovation and industrial discipline, sleek, lethal, and patient. While other planes clawed for range or traded speed for endurance, the Mustang carried all three in perfect balance. At the heart of this steel predator lay a sound unlike any other, the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin. When the throttle opened, its 12 cylinders drank deeply of the morning air, supercharged and precise. This was not the lumbering growl of the past, but a clean, hard-edged note, power sharpened into music. With two-stage, two-speed supercharging, the engine breathed effortlessly at altitudes that starved its Japanese opponents. Where enemy radials gasped, the Merlin simply climbed. The Mustang could cruise for over 1,500 miles on dual 110-gallon drop tanks, crossing stretches of ocean once thought suicidal for single-engine fighters. It wasn't speed alone, though 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet was formidable, but the quiet certainty of endurance that made the Mustang terrifying. It could appear where it should not, linger where others could not, and strike where defenses were never planned. Its wings were the true secret. The laminar flow design kept the air smooth across its surface far longer than conventional shapes, slashing drag by more than a third. This was why the Mustang could cruise economically at distances others could only dream of. It was why Tokyo was no longer safe. Then there was the matter of firepower, the cold arithmetic of destruction. 6 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns sat inside those wings, each firing at 800 rounds per minute. A single burst meant 80 armor-piercing incendiary rounds slamming into a target every second. Each bullet weighed 46 grams, traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Against aircraft skin and fuel tanks, a few strikes could transform a fighter into a falling torch. But technical excellence alone doesn't win wars. Production does. In California and Texas, factories turned blueprints into reality around the clock. Conveyor belts clattered, riveters sang their metallic chorus, and aircraft emerged with relentless regularity, one Mustang every hour at peak. It was warfare measured in output. By war's end, over 15,000 Mustangs would take to the skies, most of them the D model. That number alone dwarfed Japan's entire fighter production of the war's final years. Pilots trusted the Mustang because it was predictable. Every instrument, every switch, every response was the same from cockpit to cockpit. A man could climb into a Mustang he'd never flown before and feel at home by the time his wheels left the ground. It was a precision tool, not a handcrafted relic. This consistency gave its pilots confidence, a quiet, unshakable edge that Japanese aviators could feel even before the first shot was fired. The aircraft wasn't just fast. It wasn't just powerful. It was the physical expression of a nation's capacity to turn science into steel at scale. It was the distance between theory and certainty, between hope and inevitability. Over Tokyo, the Mustang wasn't simply flying, it was declaring that the war's balance had shifted. In the glow of that dawn, the Mustang's shadow stretched longer than its wingspan. It carried more than fuel and ammunition. It carried inevitability. While the Mustang embodied industrial precision, the aircraft waiting to oppose it was born of urgency. The Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, Gale to its designers, frank to the Allies, was Japan's last, desperate attempt to build a fighter that could stand toe-to-toe with the modern machines streaming from American factories. On paper, it was formidable, fast, agile, and well-armed. But war is never fought on paper. When the Ki-84 entered service in mid-1944, the Empire's industrial machine was already unraveling. What should have been a frontline game-changer arrived too late and in too few numbers. Japanese engineers had crafted a sleek, high-performance airframe powered by the Nakajima Ha-45 engine, a complex, 18-cylinder radial capable of producing 2,000 horsepower in ideal conditions. Test flights promised speeds near 430 miles per hour. In a perfect world, it could outclimb and outmaneuver even the best American fighters. But Japan no longer lived in a perfect world. Factories bombed to rubble struggled to maintain tolerances. Steel arrived with impurities. Heat treatment faltered. Landing gear buckled on uneven runways. Engines coughed and died under strain. Each aircraft became an individual. Some fast and deadly, others sickly from birth. No two were the same, and none could be fully trusted. The Hayate carried an impressive punch. Two 30mm Ho-155 cannons and two 20mm Ho-5. But its total ammunition load, roughly 400 rounds, gave its pilots only seconds of fire in combat. The Mustang's guns, by comparison, could sustain engagements, allowing American pilots to fire with patience and precision, while Japanese pilots lived on bursts and hope. Fuel was an even crueler enemy. While American Mustangs burned 100-octane aviation gasoline shipped from across the Pacific, Japanese fighters sputtered on what the homeland could scrape together. Synthetic fuel from coal, pine roots, even sake byproducts. By 1945, some Hayate engines ran on 80-octane fuel, starving their cylinders and shredding themselves mid-flight. Maintenance crews fought a losing war with clogged injectors, fouled plugs, and warped components. Reliability became a dream, and pilots learned to live with risk as part of their pre-flight checklist. Production mirrored this slow disintegration. In the same months American factories turned out thousands of identical Mustangs, Japan managed only a few thousand Hayates in total. Many never left the ground for lack of parts. Others were cannibalized, reduced to empty shells behind hangars. Pilots would walk the flight line knowing their lives depended on whichever aircraft happened to start that morning. Even its advantages became traps. The Hayate's speed edge at low altitude vanished above 20,000 feet, where the single-stage supercharger choked on thin air. Its once brilliant performance dulled to mediocrity. Against the Mustang's Merlin engine, still breathing effortlessly, it was like a sprinter running uphill through fog. And yet, for all its flaws, the Ki-84 symbolized the last heartbeat of Japan's aerial ambition. Young pilots climbed into its cockpits with burning conviction, fully aware they were flying machines built in the twilight of a dying war machine. The Hayate was beautiful, fast, dangerous, unpredictable. But it was a blade with a cracked edge, forged too late to change the outcome. The bombers appeared in the distance like a slow-moving constellation, silver shapes glinting in the rising sun. Their formation was disciplined, almost serene, as if a small fleet of airborne giants had emerged from the haze. Captain Artbridge would later call it a school of silver fish moving as one. To the Mustang pilots, this was the moment they had spent months training for. To the Japanese defenders, it was the moment their world cracked open. For hours, the P-51s had been crossing the Pacific, riding needle-straight compass headings and the faint pull of radio beacons. Every minute was a test of trust, in instruments, in machines, in each other. They had climbed slowly to altitude, their superchargers humming in perfect sequence as the ocean slipped away beneath their wings. Mount Fuji loomed ahead, its snowy peak cutting through the morning mist like a silent witness. When they finally reached the rendezvous point, the timing was perfect to the minute. 103 Boeing B-29 superfortresses of the 73rd Bomb Wing circled in a wide, deliberate arc. Below their bellies hung tons of incendiary bombs destined for Japan's war industry, or what was left of it. As the fighters slid into escort positions, the formation became something far more terrifying: an armada. For the first time in the war, American fighters would accompany the bombers all the way to the heart of Tokyo. On the ground, the sound reached first. It was different from the drone of B-29s alone, sharper, layered. Japanese radar operators reported the incoming wave, but even then, few believed the data. Fighters? Impossible, one officer muttered in disbelief. Their commanders had insisted that such a mission couldn't be done. Geography was supposed to be their shield, yet within minutes, the truth screamed across the sky. P-51 Mustangs, dozens of them streaking ahead of the bombers. Land-based fighters where only bombers were ever expected. The defenders scrambled, engines roaring, cockpits slamming shut. Flight Sergeant Totanamizu of the 56th Sentai would remember that moment with a chill. We thought the report was wrong. Then we saw them. I had trained my whole life believing no American fighter could reach Tokyo. And then, there they were, flying above us like they owned the air. The scramble was chaotic. Interceptors clawed upward. Ki-84s, aging Ki-43s, a few Zeros still clinging to the fight. But their formations were uneven, hastily assembled, lacking the practiced rhythm of their opponents. The Mustangs, by contrast, moved like a single creature. They dropped their external tanks as they crossed the coast, silver cylinders tumbling toward the earth and exploding across fields. Then they spread out, preparing for contact. Major James B. Tapp led his flight into the first clash. From altitude, the Japanese interceptors looked like black specks rising through a veil of cloud. The Mustang's advantage was immediate and brutal. With more than 100 miles per hour of extra speed in a dive, Tapp's unit sliced through the climbing enemy formation before they could level off. Tracers lanced through the sky, bright red and deadly precise. They came in threes, but they never moved together, Tapp wrote later. The leader attacked, the others hesitated. We hit them before they even understood the fight had begun. For Japanese pilots, it wasn't just the shock of battle, it was the shattering of a myth. They had been told that American fighters could never reach the capital. Now they were losing aircraft over their own homeland before the bombers had even released their payloads. The fight didn't last long. It didn't have to. Within minutes, burning aircraft spiraled downward into the rice fields and coastal waters below. The Mustang pilots pulled back up through their own contrails, regrouping without a word. In the bombers behind them, crews watched the escort sweep the sky clean with surgical efficiency. The message was clear. Tokyo was no longer untouchable. Air combat is decided long before the first round is fired. It begins in classrooms, in hangars, and over training fields, and by 1945, the gap between how the Americans and Japanese prepared their pilots had become a canyon. Lieutenant John Bennett, one of the young men escorting bombers over Tokyo that April morning, had logged more than 400 hours of flight time before ever entering combat. He knew the Mustang like it was part of his own body. Every emergency procedure, every engine quirk, every control response was drilled into him until it became instinct. In his squadron, navigation across the Pacific wasn't something they improvised. It was rehearsed, refined, and then repeated again until error became impossible. Across the ocean, Japanese cadets of the same age were learning something else entirely: how to take off and fight in aircraft they had barely flown. Many reached combat units with fewer than 100 hours total, some with only 50. Shortages of fuel in aircraft meant training was rushed, sometimes conducted in outdated biplanes, and often ended with pilots still unfamiliar with their operational fighters. They were expected to make up the difference with spirit and courage. But courage doesn't correct navigational error. American missions began weeks in advance, with intelligence officers laying out routes, altitudes, fuel burn calculations, and emergency procedures. Weather aircraft flew ahead to map out the conditions. Navigation was a science. Each Mustang carried detailed maps, radio beacons guided their path, and their crews understood the ocean crossing down to the gallon. Even the flight paths of lifeguard submarines were synchronized with the fighter routes. That rescue network was a quiet weapon. Beneath the Pacific, dozens of American submarines loitered just under the surface, waiting to retrieve downed pilots. They were joined by PBY Catalina flying boats, ready to swoop in if someone hit the water. Every Mustang pilot knew that even if disaster struck, someone might come for him. That knowledge gave them confidence, the kind that turns precision into aggression. For Japanese pilots, no such safety net existed. If their aircraft failed or they were forced down over the sea, they vanished. There were no lifeguard submarines waiting, no coordinated rescue grid. Every mission was a roll of the dice, and the dice were loaded. Even fuel spoke volumes. American pilots carried enough high-octane gasoline to fly to Tokyo, fight, and return with a margin for error. Japanese pilots often launched with the bare minimum, praying their aircraft didn't devour more fuel than expected. When the Mustang pilots made navigational adjustments mid-mission, it was strategy. When the Japanese did the same, it was desperation. And it wasn't just resources, it was philosophy. American training prized discipline. Squadrons moved as units, trusting formation tactics and coordinated strikes. Japanese doctrine had once leaned on individual brilliance and maneuver, but by 1945, their best aces were gone, replaced by green cadets thrown into combat without time to learn. Formations broke apart under pressure. Attacks became chaotic, predictable. Over Tokyo, these invisible differences became visible in seconds. The Mustangs didn't simply outfly their opponents, they outplanned them before the engines even started. While one side relied on industrial power and methodical preparation, the other relied on hope. And hope, in war, is fragile. Every aircraft is more than metal and fuel. It exists inside an ecosystem, a web of logistics, maintenance, intelligence, and invisible signals in the air. By 1945, the American ecosystem surrounding the Mustang was a machine in its own right. Japan's, by then, was unraveling thread by thread. The first advantage was simple but decisive: radios. Mustang pilots flew with powerful, reliable VHF sets, clear enough to speak across entire formations without garble. Squadrons moved as one because their pilots were always in conversation, a fluid orchestra in the sky. Japanese radios, when they worked at all, often buzzed and cracked with static. Some fighters launched without functioning sets entirely, relying on visual signals in the chaos of combat. In an age where seconds meant survival, silence was lethal. Then came oxygen. At 25,000 feet, the human body begins to starve for air. The Mustang carried a robust oxygen system with automatic regulators, feeding pilots without constant manual control. They could focus on flying, fighting, surviving. Japanese systems were often unreliable, regulators stuck, Lines froze, fittings leaked. Many pilots simply avoided sustained high-altitude combat altogether, conceding the vertical fight before it began. Even the air itself favored the Americans. Ahead of every major mission, weather reconnaissance aircraft fanned out across the Pacific, mapping wind layers, cloud bands, and storm systems. Every Mustang pilot knew the sky before they flew into it. The Japanese defenders, cut off from reliable forecasting by bombed-out stations and dwindling infrastructure, often scrambled into weather they didn't understand. American pilots arrived with clarity. Their enemies rose into uncertainty. The difference in maintenance was just as brutal. Mustangs rolled out to the line after carefully timed inspections, engine tolerances checked, spark plugs cleaned, fluid systems flushed. Every mechanic followed procedure like scripture. Japanese ground crews did their best with what little they had, scavenged parts, recycled spark plugs, patched tires. A Hayate could fly like a hawk one day and refuse to start the next. A Mustang, by contrast, flew like a metronome. And then there was reliability. Over the open Pacific, failure wasn't an inconvenience, it was death. American mission planners knew this. That's why their fighters carried redundant systems, and why those systems actually worked. When oxygen regulators froze on a squadron of Mustangs in February 1945, an event later known as Black Friday, the incident was studied, analyzed, fixed. Technical flaws were problems to be solved. For Japan, failures were often permanent. Factories that once refined alloys and machined precision parts now produced warped fittings and brittle valves. Each mission carried risk before combat even began. Technology didn't just make the Mustang fast. It made it reliable, predictable, a weapon that pilots could trust even in the empty heart of the Pacific. That trust allowed them to focus on strategy, not survival. Japanese pilots, flying with radios that faded, engines that wheezed, and instruments that lied, carried the opposite weight. The knowledge that their aircraft could betray them. In the sky over Tokyo, that contrast was invisible to the naked eye, but it shaped every second of the battle. One side fought with a complete technological backbone at its shoulders. The other fought with what remained, and war rarely favors what remains. War is fought with steel, but it is decided in the mind. By the spring of 1945, the air over Japan carried something heavier than smoke and contrails, a shift in belief. For Japanese pilots, that shift began the day American fighters appeared over Tokyo. They had been told that the homeland was safe, that the ocean was a wall too wide to cross. But the Mustang's silver wings burned that illusion away like morning fog. When the sound of those engines reached the capital, something far deeper than a tactical position was lost. It was certainty. Many of the surviving diaries tell the same quiet story. Young men, some barely 20, describing the weight pressing on them as they strapped themselves into aircraft they didn't trust to intercept enemies they no longer believed they could stop. One pilot wrote, "We launch knowing we will not return. The sky belongs to them now. Their fear wasn't theatrical. It was structured into their missions. Every time they took off, they faced opponents with better machines, better training, better coordination, and, perhaps most crushingly, no reason to fear the return trip." American pilots believed in their aircraft. Japanese pilots believed in their odds, and morale doesn't shatter all at once. It erodes slowly, like paint peeling under rain. Each failed interception, each burning airframe, each lost friend left invisible cracks in the structure of a fighting force. The Japanese command issued orders with the language of confidence, but inside the cockpits, the truth was naked. They were defending against something they could not stop. On the other side of that sky, the psychological weight was different but real. Mustang pilots flew missions unlike anything the U.S. Army Air Forces had ever attempted. 8 hours in the cockpit, 700 miles over open ocean. A single mechanical failure could turn a routine sortie into a death sentence. Some pilots returned with hands cramped stiff around their control sticks, teeth aching from the constant vibration of the engine. Lieutenant Bennett later wrote, "The flying wasn't the hard part. It was the silence. 6 hours out and not a soul to talk to except the man on the wing. You think too much out there." Even victory carried its own gravity. Escorting bombers to Tokyo meant seeing cities burn from above. It meant landing on Iwo Jima to refuel while mechanics counted bullet holes in the wings. The pilots had won air superiority, but they were also learning the strange numbness that comes with overwhelming dominance. The kind of war where your opponent keeps coming, but you already know the end. For the Japanese, each new raid was proof of defeat. For the Americans, each successful mission was confirmation that the fight was nearing its final act. Two forces flew toward each other under the same sky, one fighting because it had to, the other because it was inevitable. In that psychological space, the war was already over. The rest was execution. When two fighters meet in the sky, the battle is often over before anyone realizes it's begun. By 1945, air combat was not the swirling, romantic duel of 1940. It was measured in bursts lasting less than 3 seconds. And in those seconds, the Mustang was merciless. Each P-51D carried 6 Browning A&M M2 50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, staggered for perfect convergence. The Mustang's stable gun platform allowed its pilots to deliver precise, concentrated fire with almost surgical efficiency. At full rate, the guns spat nearly 5,000 rounds per minute in total. Every trigger pull was a storm of tungsten and flame. Training made those storms count. American pilots practiced deflection shooting until it became second nature, firing not where the enemy was, but where they would be. Gunnery schools in Nevada and Florida produced graduates who could calculate lead angles instinctively. Before a Mustang pilot ever flew a combat sortie, he had spent hundreds of rounds perfecting the geometry of death. Their opponents, by contrast, had lost the luxury of time. Japanese training programs that once produced elite marksmen were now shadows of their former selves. Ammunition shortages meant pilots often practiced with wooden rounds or not at all. Some entered combat having fired their aircraft's guns fewer than 10 times. Even experienced men found themselves in underperforming aircraft, with unreliable gun harmonization and worn barrels. The result was predictable. American pilots opened fire from disciplined firing positions, diving from altitude, closing fast, pulling the trigger for one clean burst. Japanese pilots, by contrast, often fired too soon or too late, their formations unraveling as individual pilots chased fleeting opportunities. Lieutenant Thomas Kennedy would later describe one engagement over Honshu. "I saw 3 Franks come up at us. They were in a loose V, but they didn't stay that way. The leader broke early, the others hesitated. We rolled in from above. I fired a short burst at 300 yards, saw the tracers walk straight into his wing root. He rolled over and went down. The whole fight lasted maybe 15 seconds. 15 seconds. And the battle was decided. The Mustang's gun harmonization was carefully calculated. Most squadrons set their convergence around 300 yards, a deadly sweet spot. That meant if a Japanese fighter strayed into that cone of fire, it was being hit by all 6 guns simultaneously. The combined energy of those rounds could tear a Ki-84 apart before its pilot could even respond. But the real edge wasn't just hardware. It was how the pilots thought. American doctrine emphasized teamwork, the finger 4 formation, mutual support, wingmen who lived to keep each other alive. Mustang pilots rarely flew alone, and when they engaged, they did it with coordinated precision. One flight would dive in to break the enemy, another to finish them. Japanese formations, still rooted in earlier doctrines emphasizing individual dogfighting brilliance, couldn't match that cohesion in 1945. Too many of their best tacticians were already gone. Kill ratios told the story plainly. In some encounters, Mustangs achieved 10-1. It wasn't because the Japanese lacked courage. It was because they lacked everything else: training time, ammunition, stable machines, and a doctrine that matched the reality of late war combat. And when an engagement lasted seconds, only one side could afford mistakes. Mustang pilots flew with the confidence of men who knew their aircraft would respond exactly as expected. Japanese pilots fought knowing theirs might betray them at any moment. That kind of fear creeps into reflexes. It lives in the tiny delay between seeing and shooting, and that delay is enough to die. The Mustang turned air combat into arithmetic. If you could see the enemy first, dive from above, fire a single burst, and stay disciplined, you would win. And in 1945, the United States had trained an entire air force to do exactly that. By the final summer of the war, the air battles over Japan had lost their symmetry. What had begun as contested skies had become a one-sided performance, brutal, efficient, and almost silent in its inevitability. Japanese air power was dissolving. The once formidable fighter wings of the Imperial Army and Navy had been reduced to skeletal formations, shells of their former selves. Aircraft sat on airfields with empty fuel tanks and no spare parts. Hangars held stripped fuselages, cannibalized to keep a handful of planes flying. Mechanics with nothing left to fix walked the flight lines in silence. Fuel, the blood of any air force, had run out. The Japanese high command rationed what remained for kamikaze units, siphoning every last drop from training programs. Fighters that did get airborne often launched with barely enough fuel for a single interception, a handful of minutes over their own cities, then back to Earth or into the sea. The pilots who climbed into those cockpits were no longer veterans. They were students, boys pulled from classrooms, handed flight manuals, and told to fight a war already lost. Many had never fired their weapons in anger. Their first real mission was often their last. American Mustang pilots saw the change long before the end. Gone were the disciplined intercepts and coordinated climbing attacks. By July, defenders came in ones and twos, sometimes without formation at all, diving in desperate slashes before breaking away. Many never made it back. Others never fired a shot. Colonel George Chandler described one of the last encounters. You could see how green they were. They came straight at us, no tactics, no cover. Just courage. We rolled over from altitude and hit them hard. It wasn't a battle, it was execution. And we all knew it. Numbers told the same story. Kill ratios climbed into the 20s and 30s to 1. Mustang squadrons returned to Iwo Jima with almost no losses, while Japanese airfields lost what little remained. When raids ended, the sky over Tokyo fell into a kind of eerie stillness. The enemy simply wasn't there anymore. By August, Japan's air defense network was a ghost. Many squadrons were grounded permanently. Some fighters were towed to remote fields and buried under camouflage, awaiting a counterattack that would never come. Others were kept as decoys, wooden shells meant to mislead American reconnaissance. The last organized resistance flickered like a dying flame. On August 10th, Mustang groups tangled with a small flight of Japanese aircraft over Honshu. 7 kills. No American losses. It was the final gasp of a force that had once stormed across Asia. Behind every one of those collapsing numbers were human beings. The Americans were exhausted but resolute, counting missions, counting days. The Japanese were trapped in a downward spiral, undertrained, under-equipped, out of fuel, out of hope. Victory, by then, was not won through dogfights. It was achieved through absence. The Mustang flew. The Hayate did not. Air superiority isn't just about winning battles in the sky. It rewrites the shape of war beneath it. By mid-1945, the Mustang's presence above Japan didn't just protect bombers. It stripped the enemy of the illusion that resistance mattered. With the defenders broken, B-29 bombers flew with unprecedented freedom. Missions that once required careful coordination and risk-heavy planning became routine. American bomber groups swept over Japan in broad daylight, hitting factories, shipyards, transportation hubs, and fuel depots with clinical precision. The Mustang had given them cover, but eventually they no longer needed even that. The sky was uncontested. The effect on Japan's war machine was catastrophic. Industry had already been strangled by blockade and bombardment, but daylight bombing made the collapse irreversible. Rail lines were torn apart. Factories that built aircraft and engines were pounded into rubble. Refineries burned for weeks. Even the few remaining operational fighters often had nowhere to refuel, nowhere to reload, nowhere to land. For the civilians below, the psychological weight was unbearable. It wasn't just the thunder of bombers overhead, it was the fighter sweeps that followed. Mustangs prowled rail lines, strafing convoys and airfields, making movement itself dangerous. American aircraft appeared not as intruders, but as a permanent presence. The Japanese people watched the sky and understood. Their empire no longer controlled it. That knowledge corroded morale faster than any single bombing raid. An enemy that can strike at will is not simply strong. It is inevitable. Resistance became less a strategy and more a formality. Behind closed doors, even Japan's senior military, leaders acknowledged what their people already knew. The transformation reached its most brutal clarity in August 1945. The atomic bombers that struck Hiroshima and Nagasaki didn't fly with fighter escorts. They didn't need to. The Mustang had already cleared the sky, crushed the defense network, and made any resistance meaningless. When those 2 aircraft crossed Japan, they did so in silence. Air power had reached its apex. The war had been reduced to a one-direction equation. The U.S. could strike anywhere, anytime. Japan could not strike back. No counterpunch, no interception, no hope. This wasn't just victory in the air. It was the strategic suffocation of an entire nation. By removing the defenders from the equation, the United States had turned its air campaign into a scalpel. The bombers were the blade. The Mustang was the hand that held it steady. Wars are fought by soldiers, but they are won by machines. And machines are born in factories. By 1945, the real battlefield wasn't just above Tokyo. It stretched across the foundries of Detroit, the refineries of Texas, the assembly lines of California. The Mustang was not just a fighter. It was the physical expression of an industrial empire operating at full speed. American production lines ran with relentless precision. North American Aviation produced P-51s as though they were clockwork, every aircraft nearly identical, every component interchangeable, every bolt and brace accounted for. At the peak of output, a new Mustang left the factory floor roughly every hour. Over 15,000 were built in less than 4 years. More than half were the D variant, the aircraft that carved its legend into the Pacific sky. Standardization made this possible. A pilot could step into a Mustang on Iwo Jima, then another on Guam, and everything would feel the same, from the oxygen regulator to the trigger on the control stick. Mechanics didn't have to improvise. Spare parts fit every airframe. Repairs that might have grounded other fighters for days were often completed overnight. The machine didn't just work. It kept working. Across the ocean, Japan's factories were buckling. Bombing raids tore through industrial centers, but even before that, shortages had already gutted production. Aluminum was scarce, high-grade steel almost non-existent, precision machining unreliable. Aircraft that should have been identical rolled off the line with measurable differences: engine performance, airframe weight, gun reliability. Some Ki-84s could match the Mustang at altitude. Others couldn't even start on cold mornings. This inconsistency bled directly into combat. A Japanese pilot didn't know if the engine under his cowling would roar or cough at full throttle. American pilots, by contrast, trusted their aircraft implicitly. Trust is invisible on paper, but it wins wars in the air. Behind each Mustang that roared over Japan was a supply chain of staggering depth. Oil fields in Texas, ammunition factories in Missouri, refineries, shipping yards, convoys of Liberty ships carrying fuel, parts, and bombs. Tankers arrived at Iwo Jima daily. Maintenance crews worked in shifts around the clock. Logistics was not an afterthought. It was the spine of the entire campaign. Japan, meanwhile, had no such spine left. Shipping lanes were strangled. Factories were in ruins. Units cannibalized aircraft for parts until nothing remained but skeletons of planes that would never fly again. Mechanics tried to manufacture components by hand with whatever tools they could scavenge. Each working fighter represented not a production line, but a small miracle. It was not courage that decided the air war. It was math. American industry produced more Mustangs than Japan could produce fighters of all types combined in the war's final years, and every Mustang worked. The machine that won the air war wasn't just the aircraft itself. It was the system that built it, maintained it, fueled it, and replaced it faster than anyone could shoot it down. Japan had spirit. America had the machine. In 1945, the machine won. In every war, there is a moment when the fighting is already decided, even if no one on the front line can feel it. In the Pacific Air War, that moment came long before the final sorties. The arithmetic had already written the ending. By 1945, the United States was producing fighters, bombers, and fuel at a scale no other nation could match. Mustang output alone topped 15,000 aircraft. Add to that thousands of B-29s, escort ships, tankers, and supply convoys. For every fighter Japan built in its final year, the U.S. produced nearly 10. That ratio alone would have tilted the balance. But the math went deeper. Pilot training mirrored that gap. An American fighter pilot typically logged over 400 hours before seeing combat. Japan's late-war trainees averaged barely 100, and many much less. Even when skill levels were comparable, experience and survival rates pushed the numbers further apart. The U.S. had enough depth in training pipelines to absorb losses and keep sending skilled pilots. Japan did not. Every kill was not just an aircraft destroyed, but a pilot lost forever, a resource they could no longer replace. Fuel widened the gap to a chasm. The U.S. could move millions of gallons of 100-octane fuel across the Pacific every month. Japan was reduced to synthetic blends that degraded engine performance and ate away at reliability. A Mustang pilot trained with real engines running at full output. Many Japanese trainees learned in underpowered trainers that bore little resemblance to the aircraft they would eventually fly, if they ever reached the front line. The Mustang's impact multiplied these imbalances. One squadron with functioning logistics could fly daily sorties. Japanese units, starved of fuel, often sat grounded. A grounded fighter might as well not exist. And attrition never slowed, it accelerated. As Japan lost aircraft and pilots, each interception became weaker, less coordinated, less likely to inflict damage in return. The curve was exponential, not linear. Kill ratios made that arithmetic visible. In early 1945, Mustang groups routinely reported engagements with 10 or more Japanese aircraft destroyed for every loss. By summer, some encounters saw no American losses at all. Japan's Air Force wasn't just shrinking, it was collapsing under the weight of replacement math. Behind those numbers lay a grim truth. War is not fair. It rewards the side that can sustain damage, absorb losses, and keep fighting tomorrow. The United States had built an air war designed to do exactly that. Japan had built one that relied on perfection. And when perfection cracked, the whole system fell. This was why the skies fell silent at the end. Not because the Japanese lacked courage, not because their aircraft never had potential, but because the arithmetic of war has no mercy. Once the numbers crossed a certain threshold, the outcome was no longer in question. Every Mustang that lifted off from Iwo Jima was a calculation in motion, and calculations don't blink. They don't hesitate. They don't fear, they just add up. When the engines finally fell silent over the Pacific, the sky did not roar in triumph. It simply breathed again. The Mustang, born in American factories, tempered over Europe and unleashed over Japan, had become more than a fighter plane. It was a turning point in history, a symbol of how wars in the modern age are won not just with courage, but with systems built to endure. Its sleek silhouette became an icon of precision and reach. It carried bombers where no escort had gone before. It shattered myths of distance and safety, and in doing so, it marked the end of Japan's ability to defend its own sky. But its legacy isn't in the number of aircraft it destroyed. It lives in what it represented, the triumph of logistics, technology, training, and time. For the men who flew it, the Mustang was both weapon and companion. It carried them across ocean and flame. Many never returned. For those on the other side, it was the sound of inevitability, the hum in the distance that meant the war had already found them. In the end, the Mustang's victory was quiet. It didn't need grand battles to prove its dominance. It simply erased the enemy from the sky, and when a machine can make the sky itself one-sided, the war beneath it is already over.